August 1st, 1798. Aboukir Bay, Egypt. The French Mediterranean fleet lies at anchor, 13 ships of the line protected by coastal shoals. Admiral Brueys believes his position is impregnable. The British would never attack an anchored fleet at sunset. He's catastrophically wrong. At 2:30 in the afternoon, British masts appear on the horizon. Vice-Admiral Horatio Nelson has found his prey after months of searching. What happens over the next 12 hours will trap Napoleon's entire Egyptian army. 40,000 soldiers cut off from France with no supplies, no reinforcements, and no way home. This isn't just a naval battle. It's the moment that ends French dreams of an Eastern Empire and establishes British naval supremacy for the next century. One night of violence will destroy 3 years of French planning and doom an entire campaign. By dawn, 9 French warships will be captured or destroyed. 5,000 Frenchmen will be casualties, and Napoleon Bonaparte will be a prisoner of his own ambition. If you're fascinated by battles where tactical genius meets strategic catastrophe, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is about to get extraordinary. To understand why a naval battle in Egypt mattered so profoundly, we need to rewind to spring 1798 and understand why Napoleon Bonaparte was in the Mediterranean at all. France had been at war with various European coalitions since 1792, and by 1798 the French Republic had survived, barely, through a combination of revolutionary fervor and military genius. That genius belonged largely to one man, Napoleon. At 28 years old, Napoleon had already transformed French fortunes. His Italian campaign of 1796–97 had been a masterclass in mobile warfare, defeating Austrian armies that outnumbered him and forcing Austria to negotiate peace. He'd returned to Paris as a conquering hero, lionized by the public, feared by the politicians of the Directory, the 5-man committee governing France. The Directory faced a problem. Napoleon was too popular, too ambitious, and too dangerous to keep in France. They needed him fighting somewhere far away. Napoleon had his own reasons for wanting distance from Paris. The Directory was corrupt and incompetent, teetering toward collapse. Better to be absent, building reputation and power, than present and associated with governmental failure. When he proposed an expedition to Egypt, the Directory enthusiastically approved. On paper, it was strategic brilliance. Egypt belonged nominally to the Ottoman Empire, but was effectively autonomous under Mamluk rulers. Capturing it would position France to threaten British India, the jewel of Britain's empire and source of immense wealth. Cut British trade routes through the Middle East, establish French dominance in the region, and suddenly Britain's economic power was vulnerable. There was also the romantic angle. Napoleon fancied himself a new Alexander the Great, conquering the East and bringing civilization to ancient lands. The expedition would include not just soldiers, but savants, scientists, scholars, artists, engineers. They would study Egypt, document its monuments, and demonstrate French Enlightenment values. It was imperialism dressed in intellectual clothing, but the ambition was genuine. The scale of preparation was staggering. Through spring 1798, French ports assembled the largest expeditionary force since the Crusades. 40,000 troops gathered at Toulon, Marseille, Genoa, and Civitavecchia. 400 transport ships were requisitioned to carry them. Protecting this massive convoy would be 13 ships of the line, the era's equivalent of battleships, massive 3-decked vessels carrying 74 to 120 guns. Leading them was Admiral François-Paul Brueys de Gallier, an experienced officer commanding from the flagship L'Orient, a behemoth mounting 120 guns. On the 19th of May, this armada sailed from Toulon. 40,000 soldiers, hundreds of civilians, the scientific commission, horses, artillery, supplies for months, all crammed into 400 vessels escorted by warships. It was an administrative miracle getting them to sea, and everyone involved knew the greatest danger wasn't Egyptian resistance, but the British Royal Navy. Because Britain had one overwhelming advantage in this war: naval supremacy. While French armies dominated European battlefields, British fleets controlled the seas, and the British knew something was happening in Toulon. The Admiralty dispatched Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson with a squadron to investigate, and if possible, destroy whatever the French were planning. This began one of history's great naval chases, a cat-and-mouse pursuit across the Mediterranean that would determine the fate of Napoleon's entire expedition. Nelson searched desperately through June and July. The problem was that he had no frigates, the fast reconnaissance ships that were a fleet's eyes and ears. A storm had damaged his frigates, forcing them back to port, leaving Nelson effectively blind. He sailed to Sicily, to Alexandria, back to Sicily, always just missing the French. On the 22nd of June, the two fleets passed each other in darkness, so close that French officers later reported hearing British signal guns. Neither side realized how near disaster, or opportunity, had come. On the 28th of June, Nelson arrived at Alexandria and found the harbour empty. He'd beaten Napoleon there, but not knowing this, he sailed away to search elsewhere. Pure mathematics and wind patterns meant Napoleon's slower convoy took longer. On the 1st of July, French troops began landing on Egyptian beaches. Nelson had missed them by 3 days. The landing was chaotic, but successful. 40,000 Frenchmen poured ashore near Alexandria, disorganized and suffering from weeks at sea but intact. Alexandria fell quickly. Then came the march to Cairo through desert heat that killed soldiers unused to Egyptian conditions. On the 21st of July, Napoleon faced the Mamluk army at the Battle of the Pyramids, actually fought near the village of Mbaba, but Napoleon wasn't going to waste a theatrical opportunity. His disciplined formations and artillery shattered the Mamluk cavalry charges. Cairo surrendered. Within 3 weeks of landing, Napoleon controlled Egypt's heartland. But everything depended on the fleet. Those 13 warships and 400 transports were France's only connection to home, the only source of supplies, reinforcements, and communication. If something happened to the fleet, 40,000 Frenchmen would be stranded in hostile territory, thousands of miles from France. Admiral Brueys understood this perfectly, which is why he chose his anchorage so carefully. Aboukir Bay, 20 miles east of Alexandria, offered protection from British attack. The bay curved in a rough crescent, with the French fleet anchored in a line close to shore. Coastal shoals, shallow water hazardous to navigation, protected the landward side. Any British attack would have to come from seaward, where French guns would be ready. Brueys positioned his ships bow to stern, each covering gaps in their neighbours' fire arcs. The van, the front of the line, was anchored nearest shore. The centre included Lorient. The rear division completed the line stretching into deeper water. Brueys was confident, perhaps too confident. Many of his crew were ashore gathering supplies and water when Nelson finally, after months of fruitless searching, found what he'd been hunting. The date was the 1st of August, 1798. The time was 2:30 in the afternoon. Lookouts on French ships spotted British masts on the northern horizon. Within hours, everything would change. Nelson had returned to the Egyptian coast on better intelligence and his own intuition that the French had to be here. When his scouts confirmed enemy ships at anchor in Aboukir Bay, he didn't hesitate. Conventional wisdom said you don't attack an anchored enemy fleet at sunset. There's no time to complete the action before darkness makes naval warfare impossibly dangerous. Nelson saw opportunity instead of risk. The French weren't expecting attack today. Some crews were ashore. They'd be unprepared. And Nelson had spent the approach studying the French position and briefing his captains on a plan so audacious that only complete trust in his subordinates made it possible. He called them his band of brothers, these captains who'd served with him, who understood his aggressive philosophy, who wouldn't need detailed orders because they grasped his intent. As British ships cleared for action and bore down on the French line, Nelson was about to demonstrate why that trust mattered. Because he'd noticed something about Brueys' position that the French admiral had missed. If there was enough water for French ships to swing at anchor, there was enough water for British ships to sail between the French and the shore. The sun was setting. Time pressure mounted. and Nelson was about to attempt something unprecedented, a night attack on an anchored battle fleet, with half his ships sailing through waters the enemy thought impassable. What happened next would be studied in naval academies for centuries. Horatio Nelson was 39 years old in the summer of 1798, and his body already bore the scars of 2 decades of naval warfare. At the siege of Calvi in Corsica 4 years earlier, debris from a French artillery strike had destroyed his right eye. At Tenerife the previous year, grapeshot had shattered his right elbow, requiring amputation of the arm. He was half-blind, one-armed, and absolutely relentless in combat. Officers who served under him described a man transformed in battle. Calm becomes intensity. Caution becomes aggression. The Royal Navy had plenty of competent admirals who followed doctrine and won steady victories. Nelson wasn't one of them. He sought annihilation, not advantage. His orders from the Admiralty were straightforward: find the French expedition, discover its purpose, and destroy it. The strategic stakes were immense. If Napoleon successfully established himself in Egypt and pushed toward India, Britain's empire faced existential threat. India generated enormous wealth, tax revenues, trade goods, strategic resources. Lose India, and Britain's ability to finance continental allies against France collapsed. So everything depended on finding and destroying that French fleet before it could secure Napoleon's position. But finding 14 warships in the Mediterranean proved nightmarishly difficult. Nelson commanded 13 ships of the line, HMS Vanguard, his flagship, along with Audacious, Defense, Zealous, Goliath, Minotaur, Theseus, Orion, Bellerophon, Majestic, Swiftsure, Alexander, and Culloden. These were third-rate ships of 74 guns, the workhorses of British naval power, fast enough to chase, powerful enough to fight ships of the line, numerous enough that Britain could deploy them globally. His captains were experienced professionals who'd commanded in previous engagements, men like Thomas Foley of Goliath, Samuel Hood of Zealous, and James Saumarez of Orion. What Nelson lacked were frigates. These smaller, faster vessels served as scouts, ranging ahead to gather intelligence whilst the battle fleet followed. A storm in May had damaged Nelson's frigates, forcing them back to Gibraltar for repairs. The Admiralty never sent replacements, so Nelson was hunting blind, relying on merchant ship reports, coastal observations, and educated guesswork about where 400 French vessels might be heading. The chase began in late May and stretched through June and July. Nelson sailed to Sicily, questioned everyone, learned the French had left Toulon but not where they'd gone. He sailed toward Egypt based on strategic logic. Where else could such a massive expedition be heading? But arrived at Alexandria on the 28th of June to find empty harbors. He'd guessed correctly, but arrived too early. Not knowing this, he sailed back toward Turkey, thinking perhaps the French were heading for Constantinople or Syria. The frustration was corrosive. Every day the French expedition operated unmolested was a day closer to strategic disaster. Nelson wrote in his journal about the anguish of uncertainty, the professional horror of having the enemy slip away. His health suffered. He experienced what he called a fever of anxiety, probably stress-induced illness. But he drove his squadron onwards, trusting that persistence would eventually locate the French. By late July, Nelson had returned to Sicily, gathered better intelligence confirming the French had indeed landed in Egypt, and sailed back toward Alexandria. This time he approached from the west, sending scouts ahead. On the 1st of August, lookouts reported the crucial sighting, a forest of masts visible in Aboukir Bay, 20 miles east of Alexandria. The French Mediterranean fleet, at anchor. It was 2:30 in the afternoon. Nelson faced immediate decisions. Attack now, despite approaching sunset. Or anchor, observe, and attack tomorrow morning when conditions favored complex maneuvers. Doctrine screamed for caution. Night fighting in the age of sail was extraordinarily dangerous. Ships identified each other by lantern signals easily confused. Navigation was treacherous, coordinating attacks nearly impossible. Friendly fire casualties were common. Most admirals avoided night actions unless unavoidable. Nelson saw only opportunity. The French were unprepared. Brueys had positioned his fleet defensively, but clearly expected no immediate threat. Many crew members were ashore, visible to British telescopes. Delay meant losing surprise. Attack immediately, and the French might not even have time to recall their shore parties before action was joined. As British ships bore down on Aboukir Bay through the afternoon, Nelson studied the enemy position and briefed his captains on intentions rather than specific orders. This was his leadership philosophy in action. Select capable subordinates, ensure they understand your thinking, then trust them to execute without micromanagement. He'd shared meals with these captains during the long search, discussed tactics and naval theory, built relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. Now that investment would pay dividends. The French position looked formidable. 13 ships of the line stretched in a line roughly parallel to the coast, anchored bow and stern to prevent swinging. The van, closest to shore, consisted of Le Guerrier, Le Conquérant, Le Spartiate, L'Aquilon, and Le Peuple Souverain. The centre included Le Franklin and the massive L'Orient, Admiral Brueys' flagship. The rear division under Admiral Villeneuve included Le Guillaume Tell, Le Généreux, Le Timoleon, and Le Mercure. 4 frigates, smaller warships, were positioned inshore of the battle line. Brueys' plan was sound. British ships attacking from seaward would face concentrated fire from all French vessels sequentially. The van would engage first, supported by the centre, whilst the rear could manoeuvre to exploit any British mistakes. The shoals protecting the landward side meant the French only had to defend one direction. Each French ship had springs on its anchor cables, rigging that allowed limited pivoting to adjust fire angles without sailing. It was a defensive position designed to maximize French firepower whilst minimizing British maneuverability, but Nelson noticed something crucial during his approach. For French ships to swing at anchor without grounding on the shoals, there had to be navigable water between them and the shore. Not much, perhaps a ship's width, but enough. If British captains were skilled enough and brave enough to sail through that gap, they could attack the French from both sides simultaneously. French ships had prepared their starboard guns facing seaward, but their port guns facing shore might not be ready for action. Crews would be distributed to one side, powder and shot positioned for seaward battle. Attacking from both directions would split French attention, divide their firepower, and create chaos. It was brilliant and insane. Charts of Aboukir Bay were imperfect. The exact depths near shore were unknown. A single British ship running aground would block the passage for others and become a sitting target. The approaching darkness made navigation even more treacherous. But Nelson trusted his captain's seamanship and the simple truth that if French ships could anchor there, British ships could sail there. Around 5:30 p.m., as the sun lowered toward the western horizon, the British line approached the French van. Captain Thomas Foley of HMS Goliath was leading the British column. He made the critical decision without waiting for orders. He would attempt the inshore passage. If soundings showed insufficient depth, he could still veer back to attack from seaward. But if he succeeded, the entire tactical situation would transform. Goliath approached Le Guerrier, the lead French ship, from the bow, the least defended angle. French guns couldn't depress low enough to hit targets at that angle, meaning Goliath could sail up the French line virtually unmolested until reaching the landward side. As Goliath passed Le Guerrier's bow, Foley ordered the helm over and took position on the French ship's port side. The gamble had worked. There was enough water. 4 more British ships followed Goliath through the inshore passage: Zealous, Orion, Theseus, and Audacious. They positioned themselves along the French van's landward side, each selecting a target. The remaining British ships attacked from seaward, as Brueys expected. By 6:30 p.m., as sunset colours painted the sky, the first French ships found themselves caught between 2 British lines, taking fire from both sides simultaneously. The Battle of the Nile had begun, and it would be like nothing anyone present had experienced before. The sound of a naval broadside is beyond modern comprehension. Imagine dozens of cannons firing simultaneously. The concussion is physical, slamming into your chest, vibrating through the deck, making your teeth ache. Now imagine that happening every 2 to 3 minutes as gun crews reload and fire again, with both sides exchanging fire simultaneously. The noise becomes continuous thunder, punctuated by crashes as iron shot smashes through oak planking. Add the screams of wounded men, the shouted orders, the grinding of damaged rigging, and you approach the sensory assault of a ship-to-ship action. At 6:30 p.m. on the 1st of August, that violence erupted across Aboukir Bay. HMS Goliath, having successfully navigated the inshore passage, was positioned off the port bow of Le Guerrier, the lead French ship. Goliath's 74 guns opened fire at point-blank range into a French vessel that had virtually no crew stationed on the port side. French sailors scrambled to shift guns from starboard to port, but you can't move a 3-ton cannon quickly, and every second of delay meant more British shots smashing through hull timbers. Le Guerrier's foremast crashed down within the first 15 minutes, its rigging cut to pieces. HMS Zealous took position astern of Goliath and engaged the second French ship, Le Conquérant. Orion sailed further down the line to engage Le Peuple Souverain. Theseus and Audacious followed, each selecting targets amongst the French van. Within 20 minutes, 5 French ships were fighting enemies on both sides, British ships to landward, firing into their unprepared port sides, other British ships to seaward, hammering their starboard batteries. The French van collapsed quickly. Le Guerrier's captain, wounded and watching his ship disintegrate, struck his colours, lowered his flag in surrender, before 7 p.m. Le Conquérant, dismasted and hulled below the waterline, surrendered minutes later. Le Spartiate fought more stubbornly under Captain Emeriau, shifting crews to man both sides of guns, but facing HMS Theseus from one side and HMS Vanguard, Nelson's flagship, from the other. The outcome was inevitable. By 8 p.m., 3 French ships had surrendered. Nelson's Vanguard had engaged Le Spartiate from the seaward side, maintaining steady fire whilst French resistance gradually crumbled. But naval combat is random in its violence, death arriving through splinters and shot without regard for rank. Around 8:30 p.m., debris from a French shot, probably a piece of Vanguard's own rigging torn loose, struck Nelson on the forehead. The wound was deep, blood pouring down his face and over his functioning eye. Nelson collapsed, temporarily blind, convinced he was dying. His officers carried him below to the surgeon, who was operating in nightmarish conditions. The orlop deck, the lowest deck where surgeons worked during battle, was lit by swinging lanterns, crowded with wounded men, slippery with blood. The surgeon examined Nelson's wound, whilst the admiral dictated what he believed were final instructions. But the wound, though messy, wasn't mortal. The flap of skin over his forehead had been torn loose, creating dramatic bleeding, but no skull fracture. The surgeon stitched it together whilst Nelson, realizing he would survive, insisted on returning to command. He remained below deck, his wound bandaged, receiving reports and issuing orders whilst unable to see the battle he was directing. Darkness had fallen completely by 8 p.m., transforming the battle into something surreal. Ships identified enemies by the flashes of their guns and the light of fires beginning to spread on damaged vessels. Smoke from hundreds of cannons hung thick over the bay, occasionally parting to reveal glimpses of masts and sails in the moonlight. British ships flew horizontal white ensigns to distinguish themselves from French vessels, but in darkness and confusion, identification remained uncertain. Captains ordered gun crews to aim at muzzle flashes and hull silhouettes, hoping they were targeting enemies. The French centre was now engaged. HMS Bellerophon, moving down the line, made a catastrophic error in target selection. Her captain, Henry d'Estaing Darby, positioned his 74 gunship alongside the massive Lorient, Brueys' flagship, mounting 120 guns. It was a grotesque mismatch. Lorient's broadsides tore through Bellerophon's hull, dismounting guns, collapsing masts, turning sections of deck into splinter-filled death traps. Within 30 minutes, Bellerophon had 200 casualties from her crew of 600. Her masts were gone, her steering destroyed, her gun decks slaughterhouses. Darby ordered the anchor cable cut, allowing the drifting hulk to float away from Lorient's murderous fire. Bellerophon was effectively destroyed, though she'd survived the night. But Lorient's dominance drew other British ships like wolves circling wounded prey. HMS Swiftsure and HMS Alexander, having arrived late to the battle after dealing with navigation difficulties, took positions where they could engage the French flagship without receiving her full broadsides. Their systematic fire found vulnerable points: Lorient's rigging, her masts, and crucially, her painted wooden exterior that was covered in oil-based paint and highly flammable. Admiral Brueys remained on Lorient's quarterdeck throughout, directing his ship's battle despite mounting casualties. Around 8 p.m., a British cannonball struck him in the midriff, nearly severing him in half. Standard practice was to carry wounded officers below for treatment, but Brueys knew the wound was fatal. He ordered his men to leave him on deck, placing him in a chair so he could continue commanding until death came. He lasted perhaps 20 minutes before a second wound finished him. Command passed to Captain Luc-Julien Joseph Casabianca, who had his 10-year-old son Jocante serving as a powder monkey aboard the flagship. The fires on Lorient began small, ignited rigging spreading to tarred ropes, then to painted wood, then to deck planking. French damage control teams fought the flames whilst simultaneously fighting the battle, but they were losing both contests. British shot continued smashing through Lorient's hull, killing firefighters and creating new ignition points. By 9:30 p.m., the fires were visible across the entire bay, illuminating the French flagship like a beacon. Both British and French sailors recognized what was coming. Every warship carried tons of gunpowder stored in magazines deep in the hull. If fire reached those magazines, the explosion would be catastrophic. Captains on nearby ships ordered anchor cables cut or lengthened to drift away from Lorient. French frigates inshore tried to approach and take off survivors, but British fire drove them back. Captain Casabianca remained aboard, attempting to save his ship, his young son still at his station below decks. The story would later claim the boy refused to leave without his father's permission, staying at his post as flames approached, inspiration for the famous poem Casabianca, with its memorable line, "The boy stood on the burning deck." Whether exactly true or romanticized, something similar happened that night. Around 10 p.m., the fire reached Lorient's forward powder magazine. The explosion was visible for miles, a flash that briefly turned night into day, followed by a thunderous detonation that rattled ships across the bay. Lorient literally disintegrated. Burning debris rained across the water. The shockwave rocked nearby vessels, knocking men off their feet. Then came eerie silence as both fleets ceased fire, stunned by what they'd witnessed. The burning wreckage illuminated the battlefield more effectively than any moonlight. British sailors could see French ships, some still fighting, others dismasted and drifting. French sailors could see the ring of British vessels surrounding them. For approximately 15 minutes, an unofficial ceasefire held as both sides absorbed the shock. Of Lorient's crew of over 1,000 men, perhaps 70 survived, those who jumped overboard before the explosion and managed to swim to rescue boats. Admiral Brueys was gone, vaporized along with his ship. Captain Casabianca and his young son died together. The Egyptian treasure looted from Malta and Cairo, worth millions of francs, sank to the bay floor where much of it remains today. When fighting resumed after the brief shocked pause, French morale had shattered along with their flagship. The psychological impact of Lorient's destruction was as devastating as its tactical consequences. The French van was already destroyed, 3 ships captured, others dismasted. Now the centre was broken. Only the rear division under Villeneuve remained relatively intact, but they were too far down the line to meaningfully affect the battle's outcome. As the night wore on, French ships surrendered one after another, their captains recognizing continued resistance was suicide. Dawn would reveal the full scope of catastrophe, but by midnight, the battle's outcome was decided. Nelson had achieved what he'd sought, not victory, but annihilation. The explosion of Lorient created a moment frozen in the memories of every man present. British midshipman George Eliot, aboard HMS Goliath, later wrote that the flash was so bright he could read his watch face despite being hundreds of yards away. French survivors described burning debris falling from the sky like meteors, some pieces large enough to punch through ship decks. One enormous fragment of Lorient's stern timbers crashed onto the deck of HMS Swiftsure, nearly killing several men. The shockwave caused temporary hearing loss across both fleets. In the sudden silence that followed, men could hear the hiss of burning wood meeting water, the cries of drowning sailors, the creak of damaged masts swaying in the breeze. The treasure lost with Lorient represented more than monetary value. Napoleon had looted Malta's Knights Hospitaller during his brief stop there, taking centuries of accumulated wealth, gold plate, religious artifacts, coins from across the Mediterranean. The Egyptian campaign had added to this haul with plunder from Cairo and Alexandria. Estimates vary wildly, but conservative calculations suggest millions of francs worth of valuables sank that night. Some treasure hunters still search Aboukir Bay's floor, though most assume the explosion scattered and buried everything beyond recovery. But the real treasure aboard Lorient was human. Admiral Brueys had been one of France's most experienced naval commanders, a man who understood Mediterranean warfare and had successfully convoyed Napoleon's massive expedition across contested waters. His death left French naval command in chaos. Captain Casabianca, who'd assumed command after Brueys' death, was by all accounts a capable officer who might have organized some coherent defense or retreat. Instead, he and his son became martyrs, whose deaths contributed nothing to French tactical situation. The poem that immortalized young Giocante Casabianca, "The boy stood on the burning deck, whence all but he had fled," was written by Felicia Hemans in 1826, based on contested accounts of the battle. The romantic image of a loyal boy refusing to abandon his post without orders resonated with Victorian audiences. Whether accurate in detail or not, something like this happened. The boy was aboard, did serve as a powder monkey, and died in the explosion. His father remained on deck attempting to save the ship, despite its obvious doom. In the calculus of naval warfare, such loyalty was admirable and tactically irrelevant. Both Casabiancas died without affecting the battle's outcome. After the 15-minute shocked pause, British ships resumed systematic destruction of the remaining French vessels. The psychology had shifted fundamentally. Before Lorient's explosion, French crews could tell themselves they were fighting a difficult battle that might yet be salvaged. After, they knew they were trapped in a catastrophe. Morale collapse is physical. You can see it in how men move, how quickly they respond to orders, whether they maintain fire discipline or begin looking for escape routes. French Rear Admiral Blanquet, commanding Le Franklin in the Centre Division, maintained stubborn resistance despite overwhelming odds. His ship faced British fire from multiple angles, but French discipline held. Gun crews continued serving their cannons, firing into British hulls even as their own ship disintegrated around them. Le Franklin's masts fell one by one through the night, crashing across decks and pinning men beneath the wreckage. Water poured through holes below the waterline, and pumps couldn't keep pace with the flooding. Around 3 a.m. on the 2nd of August, with his ship sinking, most guns dismounted, and casualties exceeding 400 men, Blanquet finally struck his colours. He'd fought longer than any captain in the French van or centre, and it had achieved nothing except additional casualties. Le Tonnant, another French centre ship, resisted almost as long. Her captain, Du Petit Thouars, was wounded 3 times during the night battle, first losing a leg, then an arm, then receiving a fatal wound to the abdomen. Dying, he ordered himself placed in a grain barrel so he could remain upright and continue commanding. When death finally took him, his officers hid the fact from the crew to maintain morale and kept fighting in his name until dawn made further resistance suicidal. Such courage was magnificent and tragic. Le Tonnant surrendered around 6 a.m., her decks covered with dead, her hull holed beyond repair. The French rear division under Admiral Villeneuve faced an agonizing dilemma. They were the only French ships relatively undamaged, positioned furthest from the initial British attack. As dawn approached, Villeneuve could see the devastation forward: captured ships, burning wrecks, British vessels everywhere. His ships could probably fight their way out of the bay if they moved immediately. But that meant abandoning the surviving French vessels still engaged with British ships. It meant watching comrades die whilst preserving his own force. It was the militarily correct decision and morally agonizing choice. Villeneuve chose survival. As dawn broke on August 2nd, his flagship Guillaume Tell and the ship of the line Généreux, along with 2 frigates, cut their anchor cables and made sail for the open sea. British ships attempted to pursue, but most were too damaged to chase effectively. HMS Zealous gave chase but couldn't catch the fleeing French vessels. Villeneuve escaped to Malta, eventually making his way back to France, where he faced criticism for abandoning the fleet. He'd live to command again, at Trafalgar in 1805, where Nelson would defeat him a final time. As the sun rose on August 2nd, Aboukir Bay looked like a vision of apocalypse. The water was thick with wreckage: shattered masts, torn sails, pieces of hull, bodies. 9 French ships of the line were captured or destroyed. Le Guerrier, Le Conquérant, Le Spartiate, L'Aquilon, and Le Peuple Souverain from the van were captured, but so damaged they could barely float. L'Orient was gone, her remains scattered across the bay floor. Le Franklin and Le Tonnant were captured from the centre. Le Timoleon had run aground and been burned by her own crew. Only Villeneuve's 2 ships of the line and 2 frigates had escaped. British casualties were remarkably light given the battle's intensity: 218 dead, 677 wounded from crews totaling roughly 8,000 men. Most casualties occurred on HMS Bellerophon during her suicidal engagement with L'Orient, and on ships that fought at close range during the night action. French casualties were catastrophic. Estimates vary, but approximately 1,700 French sailors died outright, another 1,500 were wounded, and 3,000 were taken prisoner. The casualty disparity reflected the tactical situation. British ships retained maneuverability, whilst French vessels were trapped. British crews fought from positions they'd chosen, whilst French crews scrambled to respond to attacks from unexpected directions. The captured French ships were in such terrible condition that several had to be burned as unsalvageable. Le Guerrier and Le Conquérant were barely afloat, hulled below the waterline in multiple places, dismasted, their decks torn apart by British fire. Le Spartiate could be repaired and eventually joined the Royal Navy, as did several others, but the immediate practical result was that Nelson had destroyed French naval power in the Mediterranean without losing a single ship of his own. His wound had been bandaged and cleaned, though it troubled him for weeks afterward. He composed his victory dispatch to the Admiralty whilst still processing the battle's scope. The language was typically Nelsonian, dramatic without being boastful, emphasizing subordinates' courage, making the victory appear almost inevitable. He recommended promotions for several captains, particularly those who'd led the inshore attack. The dispatch would reach London weeks later, triggering celebrations across Britain. But the strategic consequences were already unfolding. Napoleon, in Cairo, received news of the disaster on August 14th, nearly 2 weeks after the battle, the delay itself indicating how completely the French fleet's destruction had severed communications. His response combined public dismissal and private fury. Publicly, he downplayed the loss, claiming the Egyptian campaign didn't depend on naval support and would succeed regardless. Privately, he understood the catastrophe. 40,000 French soldiers were now trapped in Egypt with no reinforcements, no supplies from France, and no way home. The fleet wasn't just transportation, it was strategic mobility, diplomatic leverage, and psychological security. Without it, the Egyptian campaign transformed from bold conquest into a desperate struggle for survival. Nelson had done more than win a battle. He'd trapped an army and altered the trajectory of the Napoleonic Wars. And dawn on August 2nd, 1798, revealed the price of that achievement, written in burning wood and broken men across Aboukir Bay. The morning of August 2nd revealed the battlefield in harsh sunlight. Smoke from burning wrecks drifted across the bay in grey columns. The water, normally the brilliant blue of the Mediterranean, had turned murky with debris, oil from shattered ships, and things better not examined too closely. British crews, exhausted from 12 hours of continuous action, began the grim work of securing prizes, rescuing survivors from the water, and counting their own casualties. The disparity in outcomes was staggering. Of the 13 French ships of the line that had entered battle, only 2 had escaped. Villeneuve's Guillaume Tell and Généreux, both now somewhere in the Mediterranean fleeing toward French-controlled ports. 2 frigates had also escaped. Everything else was captured, destroyed, or burning. Le Guerrier, her hull riddled with shot holes, was taking on water faster than pumps could manage. Le Conquérant was little better, dismasted, and listing heavily. Le Spartiate could potentially be salvaged. L'Orient existed only as scattered wreckage. Le Franklin and Le Tonon were captured, but required extensive repairs before they could sail. Le Timoleon sat aground, burned to the waterline by her own crew to prevent capture. British ships were damaged. Bellerophon was essentially a floating wreck, requiring months of repair work. But none had been lost. This wasn't just victory, it was annihilation. Nelson had achieved something rare in naval warfare: total destruction of an enemy fleet. Most naval battles ended with damaged ships retreating, partial victories, ambiguous outcomes. Not this time. The French Mediterranean fleet simply no longer existed as a fighting force. The casualty comparison told the story in human terms. British dead numbered 218, tragic for their families, but remarkably light for a major fleet action. British wounded totaled 677, most of whom would recover. The surgeons aboard each ship had worked through the night, amputating shattered limbs, digging out embedded splinters, stitching wounds by lantern light, whilst the ship shook with continued combat. Many wounded would survive thanks to the Royal Navy's relatively advanced medical practices, using wine as antiseptic, isolating the wounded from the healthy, ensuring surgeons had proper tools and supplies. French casualties were apocalyptic. At least 1,700 confirmed dead, though the real number was probably higher. Many bodies were never recovered from Lorient's explosion or from men who drowned whilst abandoning damaged ships. 1,500 wounded French sailors required treatment, but captured ships' medical supplies were inadequate. 3,000 French sailors were now prisoners of war. Of the roughly 11,000 French seamen who'd entered battle, nearly half were dead, wounded, or captured. The French officer corps was decimated. Admiral Bruys dead, Rear Admiral Blanquet captured and badly wounded, dozens of captains and lieutenants killed or captured. Nelson's dispatch to the Admiralty reached London in early September. The response was euphoric. Britain had been at war with France for years with mixed results: victories on the seas, disasters on land, continental allies defeated, and constant fear that French revolutionary armies would somehow invade Britain itself. The Battle of the Nile changed the psychological calculus. France wasn't invincible. Her fleets could be destroyed utterly. And most importantly, Napoleon's Grand Eastern expedition had been strategically crippled. Parliament voted Nelson a pension of £2,000 annually, substantial wealth that secured his financial future. He was elevated to the peerage as Baron Nelson of the Nile. The Admiralty promoted him to Rear Admiral of the Red, a step up in the complex naval hierarchy. The East India Company, recognizing that his victory had protected their interests, awarded him £10,000. Constantinople, Vienna, and St. Petersburg sent medals and honors. Nelson became internationally famous overnight. But fame and honor meant nothing to the 40,000 French soldiers in Egypt who now understood their situation. No supplies were coming from France. No reinforcements would arrive. No evacuation was possible. They were trapped in hostile territory with limited ammunition, no access to French manufacturing for repairs and replacements, and surrounded by enemies who now sensed French vulnerability. The news reached Napoleon in Cairo on August 14th, Messengers brought reports of the disaster, though initial accounts were confused about details. Some claimed the entire fleet was destroyed. Others suggested some ships had escaped. It took days to piece together what had actually happened at Aboukir Bay. Napoleon's immediate response was to minimize the catastrophe publicly. He issued proclamations to his troops, emphasizing that the Egyptian campaign didn't depend on naval support, that they would conquer Syria and push toward India regardless, that French courage would overcome any setback. Privately, Napoleon understood the truth. His strategic situation had transformed from bold offensive to desperate defensive overnight. The Ottoman Empire, previously neutral or intimidated, now saw opportunity. If French forces in Egypt were isolated and vulnerable, why not attack? The Sultan in Constantinople declared war on France in September 1798, beginning mobilization of armies to reclaim Egypt. Russia and Britain, previously operating independently, now coordinated to exploit French weakness. A coalition was forming specifically to crush Napoleon in Egypt. Napoleon's response was characteristically aggressive. Rather than hunker down defensively in Egypt, he decided to attack first. In February 1799, he invaded Syria with 13,000 troops, intending to defeat Ottoman forces before they could organize a major offensive. The campaign started successfully. French forces captured Gaza, then Jaffa, defeating Ottoman garrisons through superior discipline and artillery. But at Acre, a coastal fortress in modern-day Israel, the campaign stalled. Acre was defended by Ottoman troops advised by a French émigré officer, Antoine de Philippot, and supplied by the Royal Navy offshore. British ships provided artillery support, fresh troops, and supplies that kept the garrison fighting. Napoleon besieged Acre from March to May 1799, launching assault after assault, but couldn't break the defenses. Worse, plague broke out among French troops. Bubonic plague, the medieval killer that still lurked in the Middle East. Hundreds of French soldiers died not from combat, but from disease. Napoleon visited a plague hospital in Jaffa in a famous propaganda moment, touching infected patients to demonstrate fearlessness and disprove rumors that plague was spreading. The gesture was brave and strategically pointless. Plague didn't care about courage. It killed rich and poor, brave and cowardly, generals and privates with equal enthusiasm. By the time Napoleon abandoned the siege of Acre and retreated to Egypt in May 1799, he'd lost thousands of men to combat, disease, and exhaustion. The Syrian campaign, meant to demonstrate French offensive power, instead highlighted their desperate situation. Back in Egypt, Napoleon faced a new crisis. In July 1799, an Ottoman army landed at Aboukir, the same bay where Nelson had destroyed the French fleet 11 months earlier. 18,000 Ottoman troops came ashore, intending to establish a beachhead and march on Cairo. Napoleon responded with characteristic speed, marching his available forces to Aboukir and attacking on July 25. The Battle of Aboukir, a land battle this time, was a French tactical victory. Napoleon's troops surrounded and destroyed the Ottoman landing force, capturing or killing most of the 18,000 invaders. It was a brilliant tactical success and changed nothing strategically. The Ottomans would send more armies. The British controlled the seas. No French supplies or reinforcements were coming. Napoleon commanded an increasingly isolated army, slowly depleting through combat, disease, and desertion. Officers who'd enthusiastically joined the Egyptian expedition now wrote letters home, those few that could be smuggled out, describing their desperation. In August 1799, Napoleon made the decision that would define his character for historians ever since. He abandoned his army. Leaving command to General Jean-Baptiste Kleber, Napoleon slipped away with a small group of trusted officers and scholars. They boarded frigates that had survived the Battle of the Nile and evaded the British blockade through a combination of luck, skill, and British overextension. Napoleon sailed back to France, arriving in October 1799. His timing was perfect. The Directory government was collapsing under corruption and incompetence. France was losing the war of the Second Coalition. The public was exhausted by years of conflict and political chaos. Napoleon arrived as a conquering hero. His propaganda machine had ensured that French newspapers reported Egyptian victories whilst minimizing defeats. Within weeks of his return, Napoleon organized the coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799, seizing power and establishing himself as first consul, effectively a dictator. By 1804, he'd crowned himself emperor. The man who'd abandoned 40,000 soldiers in Egypt somehow emerged from the disaster with his reputation enhanced. It was a masterclass in propaganda and political timing. But for the soldiers left behind, the story was grimmer. Kleber attempted to negotiate with the British and Ottomans, eventually arranging a convention that would allow French evacuation. Before it could be implemented, Kleber was assassinated in June 1800 by a Syrian student. Command passed to General Menou, who proved less capable. The trapped French army fought on, winning tactical battles but slowly withering. In 1801, the British launched a full-scale expedition to Egypt. British forces landed and defeated the French at the Battle of Alexandria in March 1801. The final French surrender came in September 1801, 3 years and 2 months after the Battle of the Nile. Under the terms of capitulation, surviving French soldiers were allowed to return to France. Roughly 25,000 of the original 40,000 made it home. 15,000 had died from combat, disease, or hardship, all because one night in Aboukir Bay, Nelson had destroyed their fleet. The captured French soldiers who finally returned to France in 1801 arrived in a country transformed. The Directory government they'd left in 1798 was gone, replaced by Napoleon's consulate. The man who'd abandoned them in Egypt was now the most powerful figure in France, and his propaganda had successfully reframed the Egyptian expedition as a qualified success, rather than strategic disaster. The returning soldiers knew the truth. They'd been trapped, besieged, and eventually forced to surrender, but publicly contradicting the first consul was career suicide, and potentially literal suicide. Napoleon's ability to spin the Egyptian catastrophe into something resembling victory remains one of history's great propaganda achievements. He emphasized the scientific contributions. The savants who'd accompanied the expedition had documented Egyptian monuments, collected artifacts, and advanced European understanding of ancient civilizations. The Description de l'Égypte, published in multiple volumes from 1809 onwards, was genuinely groundbreaking scholarship. Napoleon positioned himself as a bringer of enlightenment, not a failed conqueror. The Rosetta Stone, discovered by French soldiers in July 1799, whilst digging fortifications near the town of Rashid, became the expedition's most famous legacy. The stone contained the same text in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek, providing the key that eventually allowed Jean-François Champollion to decipher hieroglyphics in the 1820s. It was an archaeological treasure of immense importance. The stone became British property under the Treaty of Alexandria in 1801 and remains in the British Museum, a permanent reminder that Britain won the Egyptian campaign militarily, whilst France could claim cultural victory. But for General Kleber, who'd been left commanding the trapped army, there was no silver lining. He'd attempted to negotiate French withdrawal with dignity, seeking terms that would allow the army to evacuate with weapons and colours, military honour intact. The British and Ottomans initially agreed to the Convention of El Arish in January 1800, which would have permitted French evacuation. Then, the British Admiralty repudiated the agreement, demanding unconditional surrender instead. Kleber, enraged, issued a proclamation to his troops declaring they would fight on, winning as many victories as necessary to force acceptable terms. He did win victories. The Battle of Heliopolis in March 1800 saw 20,000 French troops defeat a 40,000-strong Ottoman army, demonstrating that French military skill hadn't diminished despite strategic isolation. But victories without strategic purpose are Pyrrhic. Each success cost irreplaceable casualties, depleted ammunition that couldn't be resupplied, and bought time that led nowhere. Kleber recognized the futility even as he won battles. His private letters expressed despair at the situation Napoleon had abandoned them to. On June 14, 1800, a Syrian student named Suleiman al-Halabi stabbed Kleber to death, whilst the general was examining architectural plans in Cairo. Al-Halabi was motivated by religious opposition to French occupation and possibly by Ottoman agents. The assassination removed the most capable commander remaining in Egypt, replacing him with General Jacques-François Menou, who was less militarily competent and had converted to Islam, a decision that undermined his credibility with both French soldiers and Egyptian Muslims who viewed the conversion as cynical. Menou's command lasted barely a year before the British expedition of 1801 forced the inevitable. British forces under General Ralph Abercrombie landed at Aboukir Bay, that same cursed location, in March 1801. The landing was contested, but British troops established a beachhead and marched on Alexandria. At the Battle of Alexandria on March 21st, French forces fought stubbornly, but Abercrombie's troops prevailed despite their commander receiving a mortal wound. The French retreated into Alexandria and Cairo, besieged and awaiting the end. The surrender negotiations took months because Menou clung to unrealistic hopes of relief or negotiated victory. But by September 1801, even he recognized reality. Under the Treaty of Alexandria, French forces were allowed to evacuate Egypt aboard British ships, returning to France without dishonor, but thoroughly defeated. They'd leave behind their cannons, their fortifications, and approximately 15,000 graves. 3 years in Egypt, fighting brilliantly at the tactical level, had achieved precisely nothing strategically because Nelson had destroyed their fleet in 12 hours. The treaty also stipulated that Egyptian artifacts collected by French scholars would become British property. This was how the Rosetta Stone, along with numerous other treasures, ended up in London rather than Paris. Napoleon raged about this cultural theft, but his rage was impotent. France had lost the war, and victors wrote the terms. The scientific knowledge remained French, the savants retained their notes and drawings, but the physical evidence went to Britain. For the individual soldiers who survived those 3 years, the experience was transformative. They'd seen combat in utterly foreign conditions: desert warfare, siege warfare, plague outbreaks, battles fought at the shadow of ancient monuments. They'd witnessed Napoleon's abandonment, Kleber's assassination, the slow, grinding despair of strategic isolation. Many who returned to France would serve in Napoleon's later campaigns, bringing hard-won experience to battles at Austerlitz, Jena, and eventually the disastrous Russian campaign. Some would wonder whether Egypt was a preview of Napoleon's ultimate fate: brilliant tactical victories leading to strategic overextension and catastrophic defeat. The broader strategic consequences rippled outward from that August night in Aboukir Bay. Ottoman Empire remained intact, not dismembered by French conquest. British trade routes to India remained secure, ensuring the wealth that financed Britain's continued resistance to Napoleon. Mediterranean control shifted decisively to Britain, enabling them to support continental allies and intervene in European conflicts. The Second Coalition against France, Russia, Austria, Britain, Ottoman Empire, and several smaller powers, remained viable because Egypt hadn't become a French springboard for further conquests. Most importantly, the Royal Navy's reputation for invincibility was cemented. Nelson had demonstrated that British ships and crews, led by aggressive commanders willing to take calculated risks, could destroy larger enemy fleets through tactical superiority. This reputation would matter in every subsequent naval engagement of the Napoleonic Wars. French and Allied admirals approached battles against the British with psychological disadvantage, knowing they faced captains who'd been taught to emulate Nelson's aggression. Napoleon himself never forgot Egypt's failure, though he rarely acknowledged it publicly. His later strategic decisions showed learning from the disaster. He understood that naval superiority mattered, that overseas expeditions without secure sea communications were doomed, that logistics and supply lines could determine outcomes as surely as battlefield tactics. When he contemplated invading Britain in 1805, assembling a massive army at Boulogne, he recognized it couldn't succeed without naval superiority. His fleet would have to defeat the Royal Navy to permit safe passage across the Channel. That recognition led to Trafalgar. On October 21, 1805, the combined French and Spanish fleets engaged Nelson's Mediterranean fleet off the coast of Spain. Nelson had refined his tactical approach since the Nile, using 2 columns to break the enemy line rather than the single-file approach of 1798. The result was another annihilating victory. 22 Franco-Spanish ships captured or destroyed. Nelson himself killed by a French sharpshooter's musket ball, but dying, knowing he'd secured victory. Trafalgar ended any possibility of Napoleon invading Britain and established British naval dominance for the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars. Admiral Villeneuve, who'd escaped from the Nile in 1798, commanded the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar. He'd spent 7 years knowing he'd fled whilst comrades died, carrying the reputation of the admiral who'd abandoned the Mediterranean fleet. At Trafalgar, he fought courageously, his flagship Bucentaur engaging multiple British ships before being forced to surrender. Captured, he was eventually released and returned to France, where he committed suicide in April 1806, stabbing himself multiple times. Whether guilt over the Nile, shame over Trafalgar, or fear of Napoleon's wrath motivated him, we'll never know. But his suicide closed a loop that began in Aboukir Bay. The Battle of the Nile's legacy extended beyond the Napoleonic Wars. Naval tacticians studied Nelson's approach for decades: the aggressive pursuit, the willingness to attack at sunset despite conventional wisdom, the trust in subordinates to execute without detailed orders, the focus on annihilation rather than cautious victory. The Nelson touch, as it became known, influenced naval doctrine in multiple countries. When steam power and ironclad ships eventually transformed naval warfare, the fundamental principles Nelson demonstrated, seize initiative, attack aggressively, exploit enemy mistakes, remained relevant. For Egypt itself, the French occupation left complicated legacies. The systematic documentation of monuments and artifacts sparked European fascination with ancient Egypt, leading to Egyptology as a scholarly discipline. This had both positive effects, preservation of knowledge, archaeological discoveries, and negative ones, wholesale looting of artifacts, colonial attitudes toward Egyptian culture, European powers treating Egypt as a prize to be competed over rather than a nation with agency. The French expedition didn't conquer Egypt long-term, but it marked Egypt's forcible entry into European geopolitical calculations, beginning processes that would lead to British occupation in 1882 and wouldn't end until mid-20th century decolonization. 3 years of French occupation, enabled by a fleet that survived exactly 12 hours of battle. That's the ultimate measure of Nelson's victory, not just ships destroyed or casualties inflicted, but years of strategic consequences flowing from a single night's action. The Battle of the Nile stands as one of history's decisive engagements because it demonstrated a fundamental truth about warfare. Tactical brilliance at a crucial moment can determine strategic outcomes for years. Nelson didn't just win a naval battle on August 1, 1798. He ended French naval power in the Mediterranean, trapped Napoleon's army, strengthened the anti-French coalition, and established principles of naval warfare that would influence doctrine for generations. The immediate strategic impact was Mediterranean control. Before the Nile, French and British fleets competed roughly equally in the region, with neither side able to establish permanent dominance. After the Nile, British squadrons operated with impunity. They could transport troops to support allies, blockade French-held ports, intercept supply convoys, and project power wherever needed. This enabled Britain to support the Kingdom of Naples against French invasion, assist Austrian forces in northern Italy, and maintain communication with Ottoman forces in the eastern Mediterranean. The Second Coalition against France, which had been fragmenting under pressure, solidified because British naval power provided both material support and psychological confidence. French naval recovery never achieved pre-Nile levels during the remaining Napoleonic Wars. The sheer material cost was staggering. 9 ships of the line represented years of construction, thousands of oak trees, tons of iron for guns and fittings, rope by the mile for rigging. Replacing them required time France didn't have whilst fighting continental wars. More importantly, the experienced officer corps was decimated. Captains, lieutenants, sailing masters, gun captains, the professionals who made wooden ships function, were dead or captured. Training replacements took years, and newly trained officers lacked combat experience that only actual battles provided. Nelson's tactical innovations became doctrine studied in every naval powers academies. His willingness to attack at sunset violated conventional wisdom that night fighting was too dangerous and unpredictable. His trust in subordinate captains to execute his general intent without detailed orders required excellent officer selection and training, but enabled flexible response to battlefield conditions. Most importantly, his focus on annihilation rather than marginal victory, risking his ships to completely destroy enemy forces, produced strategic results that cautious victories never achieved. The Nelson touch wasn't a single tactic, but a philosophy. Aggressive action beats defensive caution, initiative beats reaction, and concentrated force at decisive points beats dispersed forces trying to defend everywhere. At the Nile, this meant sailing some ships inshore where French weren't prepared, whilst attacking simultaneously from seaward. At Trafalgar 7 years later, it meant 2 columns punching through the enemy line to create melee combat where British superior gun crews could dominate. Naval officers absorbed these lessons, and British naval doctrine for the next century emphasized aggressive, decisive action. But Nelson's approach also revealed why he was both brilliant and lucky. The inshore attack at the Nile required precise seamanship. One ship running aground would have blocked others and potentially turned victory into disaster. The sunset attack meant fighting through darkness when friendly fire and navigation errors were likely. These were calculated risks, not recklessness, but they required exceptional subordinates who could execute without micromanagement. Nelson was fortunate to have captains like Foley, Hood, and Saumarez, who possessed both skill and confidence to make split-second decisions. Lesser officers might have turned Nelson's boldness into catastrophe. Napoleon's career paradoxically benefited from Egyptian disaster. His abandonment of the army in August 1799 should have destroyed his reputation. Generals who desert their troops typically face disgrace or execution. But Napoleon's propaganda skills and political timing transformed potential disgrace into opportunity. He arrived in France when the Directory was collapsing, positioned himself as the strong leader needed to restore stability, and seized power before anyone could effectively challenge his Egyptian record. Within months, he was first consul. Within 5 years, emperor. This reveals something crucial about military history. Tactical and strategic success don't always align with political outcomes. Napoleon lost strategically in Egypt. His army was trapped and eventually surrendered, but won politically because he controlled the narrative and exploited domestic chaos. Meanwhile, Nelson won both tactically and strategically at the Nile, but British political gains were dispersed across coalition partners rather than concentrated in one leader's hands. Military victory doesn't automatically translate to political power unless you control how the victory is interpreted and exploit the opportunities it creates. The human cost of the Nile and subsequent Egyptian campaign deserves reckoning. 1,700 French sailors died in 12 hours of combat on August 1st. Another 1,500 were wounded. Over the next 3 years, approximately 15,000 French soldiers died in Egypt from combat, disease, and hardship, all ultimately because their fleet was destroyed in a single night. British casualties were relatively light, 218 dead at the Nile, but they suffered in subsequent Mediterranean operations. Egyptian civilians caught in the occupation faced violence, disruption, and exploitation, regardless of whether French or British forces controlled territory. Modern military analysts study the Nile because it demonstrates principles still relevant despite technological transformation. Naval warfare no longer involves wooden sailing ships firing iron balls, but the underlying concepts remain. Logistics and supply lines determine what armies can accomplish. Destroying enemy mobility creates strategic paralysis. Aggressive action at crucial moments can achieve disproportionate results, and trust in subordinate commanders enables flexible response to battlefield chaos. The counterfactuals are tantalizing. If the French fleet had survived, could Napoleon have reinforced Egypt with additional troops and supplies? Possibly, though British blockade would have made convoys dangerous. Could 40,000 French troops supplied from France have conquered Syria, threatened Constantinople, or pushed toward India? Perhaps, though logistics over such distances would have been nightmarish. Would Britain have negotiated rather than risk losing India? Unlikely. British strategic culture favored fighting indefinitely rather than conceding key interests. But these questions highlight how one night's combat foreclosed strategic possibilities and channeled history down particular paths. The expedition's cultural legacy exceeded its military impact. The savants documented Egyptian civilization in unprecedented detail, sparking European fascination with ancient Egypt that persists today. Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphics using the Rosetta Stone unlocked 3,000 years of history. Museums filled with Egyptian artifacts. Looted, yes, but also preserved and studied. This doesn't excuse imperialism, but it demonstrates how military expeditions create consequences beyond their immediate strategic goals. For Egypt itself, the French invasion and subsequent British intervention marked the beginning of intensive European involvement that wouldn't end for 150 years. The occupation demonstrated Ottoman weakness, encouraging European powers to view Egypt as territory to be competed over. Muhammad Ali, who emerged as Egypt's ruler after the French departed, modernized the country partly by learning from French administrative and military techniques. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, was built by a French company and became a strategic waterway that Britain seized control of in 1882. The chains of causation stretch from Aboukir Bay through the next century of Egyptian history. Nelson himself had barely 7 more years to live. After the Nile, he became Britain's most celebrated military figure, awarded honors and wealth, given command of Mediterranean operations, eventually promoted to Vice-Admiral. His affair with Emma Hamilton scandalized polite society, but didn't diminish his professional reputation. At Copenhagen in 1801, he famously put telescope to his blind eye to ignore a signal ordering retreat, proceeding with attack and achieving victory. At Trafalgar in 1805, he achieved his greatest and final victory, dying from a French sharpshooter's bullet, but knowing he'd secured overwhelming success. His funeral in January 1806 was a national spectacle, his body lying in state before burial in St. Paul's Cathedral. Britain mourned him as the savior of the nation, the admiral who'd secured the seas and enabled eventual victory over Napoleon. The column in Trafalgar Square, erected decades later, commemorates his final battle, but represents all his achievements. The Nile was where his tactical philosophy proved itself, establishing the reputation that led to Trafalgar and national immortality. Standing in Aboukir Bay today, it's difficult to imagine the violence that unfolded there over 12 hours in August 1798. The water is calm. Tourists visit beach resorts. The bay is known for windsurfing rather than warfare. But beneath the surface lie the remains of Lorient and other wrecks, slowly disintegrating into the seafloor. Occasionally, divers find artifacts, cannons, anchors, fragments of treasure, physical reminders of the night when tactical genius met strategic overreach and determined the fate of empires. The Battle of the Nile matters because it shows how decisive moments in warfare can cascade into years of consequences. One admiral's aggressive tactics and one night's violence trapped an army, ended French Mediterranean ambitions, established naval doctrine, and influenced Napoleon's eventual defeat. It's a reminder that in warfare, as in life, critical junctures matter enormously, and that sometimes the boldest action at the right moment changes everything.